looks like the Trump administration is running scared, pausing a decision at the last minute before a court appearance. My name is Brittany Page, and this is the Page Perspective. And when I say last minute, I actually mean 90 minutes before a court appearance. And what do you think that says, guys? You may remember in one of my recent videos, I talked about a proposed funding shift from the Trump administration and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD specifically, a policy change that is set to push at least 170,000 people into the streets after gutting funding for permanent supportive housing services. We're talking about nearly $4 billion in continuum of care funds, the largest source of federal funding to fight homelessness, which the Trump administration wants to shift away from evidence-based policies to short-term assistance and expanded criminalization of poverty instead. Because of the devastating consequences of such a shift in funds, experts and activists fought back, including by filing lawsuits challenging the Trump administration's policy. Because of those lawsuits, the Trump administration suddenly, again, 90 minutes before a court appearance, paused the decision, paused the policy, and I want to read this to you from Politico. Quote, according to a court filing, HUD's reasoning for rescinding the policy change was to, quote, assess the issues raised by plaintiffs in their suits and to fashion a revised notice of funding opportunity. So they plan to revise their proposal now, and this is what the judge had to say in court. Quote, the withdrawal of the notice shortly before Monday's court hearing surprised U.S. District Judge Mary S. McElroy, who said that she wasn't aware of the development. Quote, this sort of haphazard approach to administrative law is the problem, said McElroy, who was nominated by President Donald Trump in 2019 after an initial nomination by former President Barack Obama expired. Quote, you can change the policy all you want, but there's a mechanism for doing so, and it's not doing things an hour before court, and it's not doing some of the things that have been done in these cases, she said during the hearing. She ordered the government to submit new arguments by next week, addressing the last-minute change. So on the one hand, this is good news, but on the other hand, there is now a lot of fear and uncertainty about where this is headed, what the revised policy will be. What could happen to these funds as the year is quickly coming to an end and the new year is about to begin? We know what the Trump administration wants to do, what their priorities are when it comes to dealing with the homelessness crisis, and that is criminalization. That is punishment. So many of the fears related to this uncertainty are entirely justified. So to help us understand the implications of the proposed funding changes, the consequences of these policy choices, is Ann Oliva, CEO of the National Alliance to End Homelessness. Ann Oliva, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate you covering this story.
Yeah, this is a really important turn of events that is happening right now. It's really scary. There's a lot of consequences to this policy change. So if you could kind of take us through, if this goes through, if HUD, under the direction of Donald Trump, is successful in this policy change, what is to come? What are some of the consequences?
Sure. So, when I think about these policy changes with the 2025 Continuum of Care Notice of Funding Opportunity, I think about sort of three big ticket items that we're really worried about here at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. And the first is the timing. It is very, very late in the year for this notice of funding opportunity to have been released in November and then rescinded just a few days ago, right, without any idea of when it's going to be reissued. So what that means practically is that there are homeless services providers all across this country. I will tell you that I got emails in my inbox today from two different providers saying that they're going to be running out of money and that they don't know how to pay the rent for hundreds of people that are in their programs. Wow. And these are families with kids, they're veterans, they're people with disabilities, and they're seniors who rely on both the supportive services that are provided by these important programs and on the rental assistance to just afford their rent. And the projects that are eligible for renewal start to expire in January. So the timing is the number one issue that we're worried about right now. And then on top of that, we're also worried about new policies that HUD has put forth in this NOFO that cut permanent housing programs, the same ones that I just talked about that are serving lots of vulnerable people, cutting them from 87% of this money, which is normally about $3.6 billion per year. 87% of this money goes to permanent housing, and they are cutting that down to 30%. So they're capping it at a much lower number. And we know from our projections that that means about 170,000 people across this country, again, families with kids, seniors, people with disabilities, and others, will lose their housing and the services that help them maintain that housing.
You have a really helpful tool on your website with a map that does a state-by-state analysis of some of the projections of the damage that is to come. And it's really helpful because it illustrates how many people are going to be pushed to homelessness, how much funding will be lost, what percentage of housing beds are funded by the continuum of care funds. It's really a helpful tool. You can, I think, put in your zip code or look for your state and see the exact impact. Can you talk a little bit about the states that will be hit the hardest and what that looks like?
Yeah, there's two ways to look at it. There's sort of how many people, just in terms of raw numbers, will be impacted. And that tends to be the states where there are more homeless people, right? So those are states like California and Texas and Florida and New York. But the other way that I think less people are aware of is that there are a lot of states that rely more heavily on federal investment than state or local investment. And those states are usually more rural in nature and in the middle of our country. So there are states like Louisiana, there are states like Mississippi or maybe Iowa that are going to be impacted because they rely more heavily on the federal dollars to fund their system than they do on state and local dollars. So the impact is going to be felt by every state in the country, except there's one state that Wyoming will not have huge impacts, but every other state in the country will feel this impact, whether they're red or blue. It doesn't matter.
And I'm going to link to that map in the description below because I really recommend that people go and they look at that, the detailed descriptions of the impact, because it's really important. You know, something interesting that happens to me because I talk a lot about poverty, I talk a lot about homelessness, is people will come into my comments and they say, oh, so you want to do nothing? Right? And it's always this strange argument that I hear where I'm saying, no, I want robust funding of evidence-based programs, housing first programs. And it's like the nothing is coming from, unless you want to criminalize homelessness, then you want to do nothing. What do you say to critics who say the Trump administration is not increasing homelessness here? They're just rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse of the housing system.
Yeah. So I find that argument to be disingenuous, sort of at best, in part because there's a very broad array of evidence out there in the world by the research community that tells us exactly how we should be ending homelessness. And that is through interventions that permanently house people and provide the services that they want and need in order to be able to maintain that housing and to heal from the trauma of homelessness.
Right.
So the evidence base that is being sort of destroyed through this NOFO is quite significant. And here at the Alliance, we have been pretty aggressive about ensuring that there is an evidence base to the kinds of practices and program design that we put forward. And we have proof points. Veterans' homelessness has been reduced by more than 50% since we implemented permanent supportive housing for veterans experiencing homelessness in this country using evidence-based approaches and funding that permanent supportive housing at a scale that is much closer to the type of need that's out there. So when we have funding that's available at scale and we have good program design and policy in place, as well as good leadership, we know that we can actually end homelessness. And unfortunately, cutting back on permanent housing at the level that they're talking about, going from 87% to 30% of a pretty big program, will in fact make people homeless. There's no doubt in my mind about that, because these are folks that have already overcome homelessness and that are permanently housed and stably housed that will lose those supports. And that's really the saddest part of this whole story.
Yeah, it's devastating. It's really scary. And I hear from a lot of people, because I talk about those issues, that are fearful themselves. Maybe they're not in a position of stability. Maybe they are living on the edge, like so many people are, because of the affordability crisis in this country. And I guess my question would be, what do you say to people who want to get involved? What do you say to people who are hearing this right now and maybe they are fearful themselves because they don't have stability? Maybe they are afraid of what's to come for their housing, or maybe they do have stability and they're just worried and care about people that are in this position. What would you say to people who want to get involved, want to do something to help?
Yeah. So I think that you put your finger exactly on the problem that connects all of us. And that is, we have to be able to afford the housing that we live in. And for folks who are experiencing homelessness, they all have different stories. They all have different stories about what happened in their lives. But the common denominator is that they can't afford a place to live. And for folks who, for other reasons, don't want to have homelessness in their communities, don't want to see homeless people on the streets of their neighborhoods or in their community, the best thing they can do is vote for candidates that support affordable housing. Right now, we have a big program called the Housing Choice Voucher Program, or the Section 8 program is what most people refer to it as. Yeah. Only 25% of the households that are eligible for that resource can actually access it every year. So it's remarkable. Important. It's remarkable. Yeah. And people are making do. These are people with jobs, or they're seniors, or they're taking care of kids or elders in their family. And they just need to be able to afford a safe place to live. So I think that the best way that we can advocate for that is to vote for candidates that support affordable housing, to make sure that your members of Congress know that you care about this issue and don't want to see 170,000 people put on the street as a result of this change in policy, and to get involved with your local homeless service providers who are always looking for volunteers, who are always looking for help, whether it's with, special events, or it's through donations, or it's volunteering at their program. There's a lot of ways that folks can get to know people who are experiencing homelessness or who have exited homelessness. It humanizes this problem, I think, for everybody.
Those are great suggestions, and it's really important that people know where to access accurate information, and that's why I'm so glad organizations like yours exist. I'm so glad that people like you exist who are out there doing the work, helping to educate people. So thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.